Hello, and welcome to the March Wednesday webinar from the IEA Clean Coal Centre. My name is Benedicte Brox, and I'm the Communications Officer. Our monthly webinars are based on our technical reports, which are available from our website. Residents of member countries and employees of sponsoring organizations can download our reports at no charge after a one-off registration. Please visit our website for details. The subject for today's webinar is Trends in International Lending for Coal-Fired Power Plants. The report on this topic will be published in the next few days. I will now pass you over to Paul Barua. Here you go, Paul.
Thank you for the introduction, Benedict. So I just want to reiterate, I should start by saying that this webinar that you're about to see accompanies a new report that's due out in a few days, and the webinar will bring out some of the key messages from that report. Now, the availability and quantity of finance is absolutely critical to developers and operators of coal-fired power stations, and we'll be focusing on the subject of debt, which accounts for most of the funding for large infrastructure projects like power stations. The report was originally conceived due to concerns over announcements by multilateral development banks, otherwise known as MDBs, and export credit agencies. And these announcements were made back in 2013 that signals an apparent end to the funding for coal power projects, or at least that's what many of the media reports were suggesting. Similarly, in 2015, there were restrictions on the overseas funding of coal plants were tightened when the OECD rules for export credits were changed, removing support for subcritical power technologies and even supercritical plants in many cases. And the rules were changing such that the acceptance of funding overseas coal-fired power stations would only be done under the rarest of circumstances. However, also in 2015, two new MDBs were formed. The most prominent was the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, led by China, providing a potentially new source of funding for coal plants. So to help us understand the significance of these issues and others, this webinar attempts to identify the main sources of project finance for coal power plants. It examines the policies of financial institutions with respect to coal activities. We'll look at the global trends in funding, although we will visit and revisit various trends throughout this webinar, and also consider the future prospects for the financing of coal-fired power stations. Now, for the purposes of timekeeping, I'll try and keep these messages brief, but a great deal more detail and breadth is available, of course, in the reports. Now, as part of the introduction, I'd like to just show you a trend. This chart comes from the IEA World Energy Investment Report, published in 2016. It shows the annual investment in fossil fuel power stations since 2000, and we have oil, gas, and coal power investments included here. And the hashed line refers to coal power investments in China. The first thing to say is that investments in all fossil fuel generation fell 8% in 2015 to roughly $111 billion US. And this was mainly due to a drop in investments in gas and oil power. Conversely, investments in coal power increased to $78 billion US due to an addition of 85 gigawatts of capacity worldwide. Now, so the amount of investment for coal power actually exceeded that of gas and oil combined. As the hashed line shows, half of the world's coal capacity has been built in China. And here, in China, large, high-efficiency, low-emission plants, otherwise known as HELE plants, are being built at low cost and are constantly replacing smaller, older, more polluting plants. Elsewhere in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, coal is also a very desirable source of stable baseload electricity and is often the fuel of choice for countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam, where there's a much more renewed interest in HELE coal power. Now let's look at where some of this funding comes from. There are three major groups of institutions that have been identified as suppliers of project finance for coal-fired power plants. These are private sector commercial banks, public sector export credit agencies, and multilateral development banks. Now, these banks all offer similar products. They all offer debts in various forms, but there are some simple differences that separate them. Aside from the fact that they may have different perceptions of risk for projects and different business models, the main thing that makes them different is their purpose. Commercial banks offer project finance, but they also provide finance to retail and other smaller commercial customers. They often have a global presence with offices worldwide, and their aim is mainly to go for profitability. Export credit agencies are publicly funded institutions representing a single national government, and with the aim to facilitate exports and trade with other nations. So their purpose is to serve the export interests of a particular country. Multilateral development banks are publicly funded bodies as well, represented by members of several governments, often with a lead country or small group of lead countries, and their key mandates are generally to eradicate poverty and to promote socio-economic developments in some of the poorest countries. Public finance institutions like multilateral development banks and export credit agencies are generally fewer in number than commercial banks. Their participation in a project often attracts, however, private sector funding from elsewhere, especially in higher risk developing nations that's in desperate need for infrastructure. Other organisations, such as national development banks, have similar characteristics of both the export credit agencies and the multilateral development banks, and they'll be discussed throughout the webinar as we go along. This chart shows a rough estimate for the amount of funding that was made available to coal activities in the year 2014 by these various institutions I've just described. Current analysis suggests that the total investments in the coal, power and mining sectors amounted to roughly $152 billion US. And that represents the whole circle. Of this, around $60 to $70 billion was directed towards funding coal power companies. And these are the sections that are shown in blue, yellow and orange. The investment that lies within the red circle, however, is that of the multilateral development banks and the export credit agencies. Combined, these public institutions provide just $9 billion in 2014. The remainder of the circle shows the contribution, therefore, provided mainly by the commercial sector. The large sections of yellow and green are coming from the top 20 providers alone, providing about $100 billion, half of which is going to power companies and half going towards the mining sector. This funding provided financial support for various needs, such as new capital, operating expenditure, underwriting, environmental investments, and so on. So clearly, the commercial sector is the key funding source. So let's start with the commercial sector. A review of energy policies adopted by commercial banks shows a fairly mixed approach towards power projects and mining. The current policies suggest that funding coal power plants is still possible, and very few banks have withdrawn support for coal power openly, such as a few French banks. The mining sector appears to have taken more of the brunt of the so-called divestment movement that we've seen amongst some Western financial institutions, with official policies to withdraw support from coal mining projects. These policies seem rather non-selective and also apply to all coal mining. But they don't always apply to associated investments such as transport infrastructure or grid connections and so on and so forth. In the reports, we list 25 commercial banks and their bank policies towards coal-related investments. Shown here is just two examples, showing the amount of funding towards coal power and mining companies. And also the table indicates whether they have general coal policies and whether they have specific policies that demand HELE technologies. Of the 25 that are listed, 16 have committed to some form of restriction on future coal mining investments. Only 5 have HELE policies regarding coal power that determine standards for coal power performance. Yet other banks may refer to World Bank standards or similar for their form of guidance. Western commercial banks are increasingly adopting voluntary standards for large-scale infrastructure projects. One example is the Equator Principles, which uses the World Bank IFC guidelines for social and environmental standards as the foundation for their impact assessments for new projects. Around 90 banks have signed up to the Equator Principles, and generally banks in OECD countries are generally more likely to sign up to such voluntary schemes as part of their corporate social responsibility. Banks based in non-OECD countries are rather less aware of these schemes or use their own internal procedures and best practice, a feature probably more commonly seen amongst banks based in Asia. The report lists 115 commercial banks worldwide, and of which 56 participate in one or more of these 3 voluntary codes, namely the Equator Principles, the Carbon Disclosure Project, and the UNEP Finance Initiative. And the remainder of these commercial banks will have some form of internal due diligence and environmental impact assessment. Now, swiftly moving on to the multilateral development banks. In low-income nations, countries may have little or no capacity to fund and supply equipment to large infrastructure projects. Local private sector banks may be just too small or lack the expertise in large-scale coal-fired power plant type projects. And so the participation of multilateral development banks will always be desired and preferred to act as guarantors for the funding. And also their presence encourages much larger partners from the private sector as well, from both domestically and abroad. Their policies tend to reflect the leading member countries of that bank. And so, for example, the World Bank, the European Investment Bank, the EBRD, European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, and the Asian Development Bank will be reflected by OECD leadership on climate issues and other environmental matters. For many institutions like the World Bank Group, funding for coal plants is still possible in poorer nations where alternatives to coal plants are not economically viable, but will still meet the environmental impact assessments. Banks like the EBRD and the AIIB, the European Investment Bank, use detailed analysis of levelised cost of electricity, or LCOE, and the measure will either be in dollars or euros per megawatt hour, but they impose quite strict internalised costs for SOx, NOx, PM2.5 and PM10. The European Investment Bank also imposes CO2 performance standards set at 550 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, equivalent to that of a high-efficiency CCGT plant. Despite this apparently insurmountable hurdle for coal plants, however, there are exciting developments coming from China in terms of HELE coal technology, which could enable some coal plants in the future to get close to some of these CO2 performance standards. Now, in addition to the health impacts, environmental, ecological and social issues are also considered for the supply chain for the fuel as well. So often the coal mining and the transport may be lumped in when considering the overall environmental impact of a coal-fired power plant. So it makes it particularly challenging for coal plants to look favourable in terms of the levelised cost of electricity compared to other alternatives when these banks are considering and doing investment appraisals. So every aspect of the project is scrutinised. With all that said, however, there are a number of projects which appear to fall within the World Bank selection criteria, such as there is a proposed coal plant in Kosovo, and there are rehabilitation projects of coal plants in Asia, such as in West Bengal, and these are currently in the planning stages and ongoing, and the details are all in the report. Moving on to export credit agencies and development banks. These are national institutions set up by a single member, usually a government, and the development banks are also set up by single national governments with a similar mandate to that of a multilateral development bank, i.e. to aid poverty and to help developing countries, particularly in low middle income economies, to in terms of economic development, welfare, health, so on and so forth. And together these organisations are often called bilateral finance institutions. This chart illustrates the total funding provided to coal power and mining projects provided by major public finance institutions over an 8-year period, and the scale is in billions of dollars. These include MDBs, however some of the largest organisations are actually export credit agencies and development banks from Japan, China and Korea, as designated here on the x-axis by their national flags. The leading credit agency is called the Japanese Bank of International Cooperation, or JBIC. JBIC's provided more than $12 billion of funding towards coal power plants since 2007, and it aims to fund more in the future. Asian bilateral financial institutions account for roughly 2/3 of the total funding that you see in this chart. And so therefore what we can get from this is that it indicates the fairly robust support for coal power, funding from quite a surprising range of Asian financial institutions. Now looking to the future, what are the prospects of funding? They've definitely greatly improved in many industrialising regions of the world, as reflected by the funding agencies that we saw in the previous slide. In the last 7 years alone, there's been some 526 gigawatts of new coal plants that have come online. 200 gigawatts of new coal capacity is actually under construction and will be built in 37 countries. All of these plants have been more or less committed and have been fully funded. Another 600 gigawatts is in the planning stage and provides considerable opportunity for banks and credit agencies to participate further in some rapidly growing markets for coal power. Most of the new capacity will be based in Asia. 70% of the plans are actually for China and India. As OECD Europe and North America retire old plants, as predicted, the world's coal fleet is getting younger. The demands to minimise CO2 from power plants, at least cost, means the prospects are looking more promising for HELE coal in many parts of the world where coal power is actually expanding. To illustrate this, this map illustrates the regions of the world and is colour-coded in accordance per capita gross national income. The countries marked in yellow, orange and red are middle to low income economies with per capita income of roughly $12,500 or less. And the middle income economies see fairly good prospects for coal investments where there's much higher growth in electricity demand in these particularly dynamic countries. And these will include countries across Southeast Asia and also include India and China, although growth may be slowing down in China somewhat. Low-income countries may seek funding from multilateral development banks, perhaps more from the new Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and many of these countries seeking funding from institutions like this include Pakistan, Bangladesh, and many countries in Central and Southern African nations. According to the IEA, these regions could see a substantial rise in coal power, requiring an additional 1,200 million tonnes of coal equivalent of coal to fuel these power stations. And all of this new market expansion will require funding, not only in the power generation sector, but also in the coal supply sector as well. Now, the growth regions for coal power are typically industrialising nations, as I've just shown. And these nations are in need of stable, affordable baseload power. Most of the low and middle income countries in the previous map are also signatories to the Paris Agreement, COP21. Many of the targets, however, agreed involve cuts from business as usual scenarios or greenhouse gas intensities, and they're not based on historical absolute baselines the way it is for most OECD nations. So therefore, the CO2 targets for many of the areas where you see growth for coal power in the future fully recognise the ongoing growth in their economies of these fledgling economies. Consequently, the targets may well include HELE coal technologies as part of the portfolio with other low-carbon technologies, while meeting their individual intended national determined contributions. So early in the presentation, we reviewed the financial institutions that provided funding in the past, but now we'll move on to who could potentially finance HELE plants of the future. Now, this chart shows some of the world's leading development banks in terms of assets in $1 billion. The two banks at the top are from China. They are the China Import-Export Banks, or CEXIM, and the other is the China Development Bank, or CDEB. Together, the CDB and the CEXIM hold more assets at $1.8 trillion than the combined Western-backed MDBs put together. The point is, these banks are two of many banks that exist in China that could invest in HELE coal into the future, both domestically and overseas. And on top of that, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank could still also add even more funding if it was included in this group of institutions. In addition to this list, of course, there are the major banks in China. There are credits and development agencies of Japan, namely JBIG, and another development agency called JICA, another Japanese public institution. They've all funded numerous coal plants around the world and have pledged to fund new plants. Still focusing on China, the country has set out a number of strategies to expand their business abroad, and this will also include exporting power plant technology as part of this strategy. This has been spearheaded by Chinese government policies involving its Going Out policy and the Silk Road program. And the intention of this is to expand China's trade and international partners. A most interesting new development I've already mentioned was the formation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB. Led by China, it's headquartered in Beijing and is offering $10 to $15 billion per year in infrastructure finance. It has more than 50 member countries, including OECD nations, although the bank has its own set of standards based on governance, accountability, environmental and social responsibility. The AIIB is already facing interesting challenges regarding its policy to coal investments, and its latest update on its energy strategy is as follows. Carbon-efficient oil and coal-fired power plants would be considered if they replace existing less efficient capacity or are essential to the reliability and integrity of the electricity systems, or if no viable or affordable alternative exists in specific cases, particularly in low-income countries. So even though the AIIB has yet to finance any coal plants in its current portfolio, HELE coal is far from ruled out in terms of future opportunities. Now, leaving the AIIB aside for a moment, if we looked at some of the investments that China has had in the planning process, we see that investments could grow from $21 billion in the past to $35 billion in coming years. The China Development Bank and the China Exim Bank have been the major providers of overseas funding for coal plants, but in future, the profile of funding could change markedly. Future funding might be sourced from mainly commercial banks like the Bank of China and the Industrial and Construction Bank of China. In addition, there will be an increased role for equity ownership of assets too. Debt is usually offered, however, as the main sort of form of funding, and debt from Chinese banking institutions as well as other Asian institutions often come with some tie-ins, such as funding will come with, provided it's used for purchasing, say, preferred Chinese equipment from preferred manufacturers. Often the loans are offered at lower interest rates than market rates, especially from the Exim Bank. And some agreements may be repaid in kind by gaining access to natural resources, for instance, such as securing oil and gas resources in other countries, two particular commodities that China is a major importer of. Other terms and conditions that Asian banks offer, particularly the Chinese banks, are generally more generous than that expected from Western institutions, such as a greater availability of funds, much more flexible repayment terms, and there's generally less requirements for structural reforms in the energy sector. Now, the impact of Asian funding on HELE coal investments in the future. Now, there's a notion that the increase in Asian funding will be accompanied by an expansion of less efficient, cheaper coal technologies. Now, while it may have been the case in the past, the current crop of new power plants being built do not suggest this. This chart actually comes from the Platts database, and it looks at the amount of coal power capacity that Asian manufacturers in China, Japan and Korea are building overseas. As the chart shows, China appears to be a leading provider of steam boiler systems amounting to 10 gigawatts, a great deal of which is supercritical and ultra-supercritical technology. Therefore contrary to those concerns that China would be supplying low-efficiency systems. In blue, they're circles. There are a few subcritical systems still being invested in overseas, but these are generally much smaller units that are so small that maybe 300 megawatts or less are not large enough to benefit from the HELE technologies. Japan and Korea appear to have abandoned supplying subcritical steam systems and export entirely supercritical and USC systems, but this probably suggests more that they're focusing on larger scale projects. If this chart is an indication, the trend of Asian financial institutions funding HELE technologies might be advancing faster than we initially thought. So finally, we're moving on to some of the key messages on the last few slides left in the webinar. We briefly touched on some of the key issues contained in the report. So despite the withdrawal of finance from Western multilateral development banks, their role in financing coal projects is rather small. Western commercial banks have imposed restrictions on coal mining investments, but very few have done so for the power sector. And the commercial sector is actually still, and probably will be in the future, the major source of financing for coal power projects. The coal contribution made by public financial institutions such as MDBs and ECAs may be small, but nevertheless their participation may remain critical in attracting private investment, particularly for projects in poorer nations. And Asian institutions are also taking a much greater role in leading overseas coal projects. And the new AIIB may be also a new opportunity for low-income countries to look to get funding to develop coal power. But the AIIB is currently in its early days of funding. Financing is increasingly shifting towards non-OECD nations in need of reliable and affordable electricity, particularly where gas and renewables are less viable or are insufficient for the country's needs. Asian finance is also helping new coal plants in the Middle East, such as in Morocco and the UAE, and even on the doorstep of Europe. There are plans to build plants in Serbia, Bosnia, Greece, Romania, and Bulgaria using Asian funding and equipment. However, where Western financial institutions are withdrawing, Asian firms are coming to the aid of many of the Southeast Asian nations, which is where some of the key growth in future coal power is expected to be. HELE coal is being adopted widely and supplied increasingly by firms from Chinese, Japanese, and Korean firms. But we shouldn't rule out also the Western firms such as General Electric, Babcock and Wilcox as well. This is an important trend, as these HELE investments would help economies in many parts of the world avoid CO2 emissions that would otherwise come from less efficient plant designs. And so definitely these developments in the coal markets definitely paving a way to a lower carbon economy without compromising energy security and affordability. So those are just some of the key messages, but there are also some final thoughts that we should think about. There are some other issues that merits further research, but hasn't been covered in a great deal of depth in the reports. We've already discussed how Asia is determining the finance and technology choice of many new power projects. But if Western financial institutions avoid engagement and dialogue with low and middle income countries regarding coal power, there is a potential that there could be a delay, the closure of old polluting plants, and therefore preventing savings made by replacing them with HELE technology. Western-based manufacturing companies such as GE and Babcock and Wilcox are forging strong partnerships in Asia, and they're also discovering new opportunities and expanding to supply specialist advanced systems to improve the performance and reliability of existing technologies. So these firms are actually included in the report, and there is some discussion in what these companies are providing and their areas and their regions of activity. There's also another thought that Western banks will lose market share in the larger energy market as they narrow their funding opportunities away from fossil fuels towards a narrower renewables market. And finally, many Western commercial banks have withdrawn from funding in the mining sector, as we've already mentioned. And while most production is geared towards steam coal, it'd be interesting to see what would happen if a withdrawal of investment from coking coal mining would have, and the impacts on world steel prices and quality, and the impacts on the larger steel using manufacturing industries. So anyway, those are some final thoughts, and we sort of conclude and come to the end of the presentation. We shall now just look through and look at some questions, and there is a questions box at the top of the page, so please send them through. I'll do my best to answer them, but if I can't answer them online and live, I'll definitely get back to you if you leave your email address and get you via email. So I'll now hand over to Benedict. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I think there's a couple of questions here for us. The first one is, what do you think is the cause of the slowdown in implementing new plants in India? Could it be financing, diversion of funds to implement new emission control equipment, or possibly failing costs of renewables?
That's a very good question. In India, in particular, I don't really know what's the actual cause of the slowdown, but I imagine it'll be a number of features. It may be garnering finance. It could be also, in order to get finance, you often have to secure coal supplies, and there may be disruptions in getting contracts with long-term coal supplies. So that, of course, that would slow things down. And definitely funds towards new emission control equipment. But I haven't actually measured that, but I think that's definitely an area for future research, possibly for an India-specific report. Is it possibly due to falling cost of renewables? That I don't know. I don't know if renewables will make a huge impact in terms of has it made an impact in the last 5 years. It will definitely have a marginal impact, but Generally, no. I don't think it would be. I don't think it would be the cause of the slowdown in the recent years.
Okay, thank you. We've got time for one more. There's one question coming here. It is, to what extent is power plant financing capturing future developments in carbon pricing?
The European Investment Bank do have escalating carbon pricing, so it does get reflected in their decisions. But and also in the UK, as you might be aware, there's a carbon price floor, so that will definitely make determine the viability of existing and new coal-fired operations. I'm not sure carbon pricing, however, is extended as far as Asian finance, where the sort of future growth in providing finance is coming from. Most of the decisions, I'm guessing, for finance in the Asian countries will, however, be based on levelized cost of electricity. 9 times out of 10, coal is always the cheaper choice. In one of the earlier charts I showed you of the investment, I don't know if I can go back towards the beginning. I should say that a lot of the slowdown in investment in in coal isn't necessarily just due to the wind down or peaking of coal capacity, but a lot of it is due to the fact that they're being built in areas where building coal plants is cheaper. The capex for a lot of the coal plants is reducing. For instance, building a coal-fired plant in Indonesia is much cheaper than that in Europe. And so there's been, even though you're seeing this massive increase in investment in coal plants worldwide, this is also twinned with a reduction in the cost of coal plants. So I don't know if that's answered the question. Hand over to Benedict.
Thank you, Paul. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. The PowerPoint is available to download from the webinar part of our website, and the report on this topic will be published next month, and it will be available on our website as well. The next webinar from us will be on coal beneficiation. It'll be presented by Dr. Ian Reid on Wednesday, the 19th of April. Thank you all for joining us today, and goodbye.